On the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, a small fleet of unmanned vessels has quietly started running trials off the port of Gulfport. According to industry reporting, the autonomous vessel maker Saronic is expanding its on-water testing to this port, putting its Marauder unmanned surface vessel through sea trials there. On its face, that sounds like a minor logistics update, a company adding a new test site. But it points to something bigger, a real shift underway in how the United States is trying to build its next navy and a scramble among private companies to be the ones who supply it. Over the next several minutes, we're going to lay out what's actually known about this expansion, what Saronic builds, why a port in Mississippi and not somewhere on the Pacific coast or back home in Texas makes sense for this kind of testing, and what it tells us about the quieter competition happening right now for U.S. Navy contracts in autonomous shipbuilding. We'll also be upfront about where the public record runs out, because a story like this has real facts and real unknowns, and the honest version keeps those two things separate. Let's start with what's actually being reported. Saronic is an autonomous vessel manufacturer that has been expanding its physical testing footprint across the United States, and according to industry coverage, the port of Gulfport in Mississippi is the latest addition. The company is using the port to run on-water trials of its Marauder unmanned surface vessel, one of the larger platforms in Saronic's lineup of uncrewed boats. The move adds a Gulf Coast testing base to a company that has, in a short span of time, gone from a startup pitching a concept to a firm that regularly shows up in defense industry coverage as a serious contender for U.S. Navy and commercial autonomous ship work. That's the reported core of the story. A new test site, a specific vessel being trialed there, and a company visibly growing its operational reach. Everything beyond that, the deeper why, the strategic backdrop, the competitive landscape, is context, and we'll flag it clearly as we go. So who is Saronic? The company was founded in 2022 and is based in Austin, Texas, and it has built itself around one core idea: making uncrewed surface vessels, boats that operate without a crew on board, using autonomous navigation software layered onto a hull, at a pace and cost that traditional shipbuilders have struggled to match. Saronic's product line has grown from smaller, scout-sized platforms up to larger vessels like the Marauder, designed for longer, more demanding missions than the company's earliest boats. The company has also talked publicly about building large-scale production capacity, including a shipyard project in Texas sometimes called Port Alpha in company statements and press coverage, meant to manufacture autonomous vessels closer to an assembly line than a traditional one-hull-at-a-time yard. Saronic has reportedly raised substantial venture capital to fund this expansion, which reflects investor interest in the idea that uncrewed vessels will play a growing role in military and commercial maritime work. We're keeping that general because the funding figures reported in the trade press have shifted with each new round, and we'd rather stay broadly accurate than pin down a number that's probably already out of date by the time you're watching this. Here's what's genuinely surprising once you sit with it. A private company picking a new test port doesn't sound like defense news. It sounds like a shipping logistics update. That's exactly why it's worth paying attention to. Companies like Saronic don't pick test sites randomly and choosing the Gulf Coast, rather than expanding again along the West Coast where a lot of Navy unmanned systems testing has historically concentrated, tells you something about where this company thinks it needs to prove itself next. So why Gulfport, specifically, as general context, separate from anything Saronic has said about its own reasoning? The port of Gulfport is a deep-water port on the Mississippi Sound, a body of water partially sheltered by a chain of barrier islands, which makes it a fairly controlled environment for testing an unmanned vessel before sending it into open ocean. Sheltered water close at hand, with the open Gulf of Mexico not far beyond it, is a genuinely useful setup for a company that needs to run structured, repeatable trials without immediately throwing an experimental vessel into the roughest conditions the ocean has to offer. There's also the matter of neighbors. The Mississippi Gulf Coast sits close to Pascagoula, home to Ingalls Shipbuilding, a major Navy shipyard that builds destroyers and amphibious ships, and it's not far from Mobile, Alabama, home to Austell USA, which builds Navy vessels including the Independence-class littoral combat ship and the Spearhead-class expeditionary fast transport. This stretch of coastline is already dense with naval shipbuilding infrastructure, a trained maritime workforce, and a Navy presence that regularly moves through the Gulf. For a company trying to build credibility with the Navy as a supplier, testing in a region where the service already has deep institutional ties isn't a small detail. It's the kind of ordinary industry logic that tends to guide site selection, even when it isn't spelled out in a press release. Now, here's the wider picture this fits into, and it's worth understanding because it's the real reason a single test site expansion counts as news at all. For roughly the last 5 years, the Navy has been openly experimenting with uncrewed surface vessels as part of its long-term plan for what it calls a hybrid fleet, a mix of traditional crewed warships and autonomous or optionally crewed vessels operating alongside them. The Navy's Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, stood up Task Force 59 in 2021 specifically to test uncrewed surface vessels and unmanned systems in the Middle East, running them alongside crewed ships under real operational conditions. Separately, the Navy has tested larger experimental uncrewed vessels under what's often called the Overlord USV program, using converted commercial hulls to prove out long-range, low-crew, or no-crew operations. And in 2023, the Department of Defense announced Replicator, an initiative aimed at fielding large numbers of relatively low-cost autonomous systems, including maritime drones, within a short time frame, framed specifically as a way to offset the scale advantage of larger rival navies. That's the environment Saronic is trying to sell into, and it's not the only company doing so. Firms like Saildrone, established defense shipbuilders such as Austal USA and Huntington Ingalls, and newer defense tech entrants including Anduril have all been developing or fielding their own uncrewed maritime platforms, each chasing a slice of what's widely expected to be a growing pool of Navy and commercial contracts for autonomous vessels. Seen in that light, Saronic's expansion to Gulfport isn't just about one boat in one port. It's a visible sign of a company widening its testing footprint, and by extension, its credibility, at a moment when several competitors are making similar moves. That's the strategic backdrop. But it's worth pausing here to be honest about something. Expanding into a new test port is not the same thing as winning a contract. It's not confirmation of a Navy deal, and it isn't proof that the Marauder is operationally ready for the missions it's ultimately designed for. What we can confirm is narrower. Saronic is testing there, and the company is growing its physical footprint. What comes after that is genuinely still unwritten, and we'll get to what remains unknown in a moment. We spent some time going through how Saronic has talked about its own growth in public statements and industry coverage, and one thing stood out: how deliberately the company frames every expansion, a new test site, a new production facility, as a step toward building vessels at a rate closer to how a car company builds cars than how a traditional shipyard builds one ship over years. Whether that ambition holds up under the realities of shipbuilding, maritime testing regulations, and Navy procurement timelines, which are notoriously slow even for products the service is enthusiastic about, is a separate question from whether the ambition itself is real. The ambition is well documented. Whether it's achievable at the scale the company describes hasn't been proven yet, not by Saronic, not by any of its competitors. Here's a take some viewers might push back on. The whole premise that autonomous vessels can be produced and fielded fast enough to matter in a near-term crisis is still unproven at any real scale. Plenty of companies, Saronic included, talk about rapid, low-cost, high-volume production of uncrewed ships. Very few uncrewed vessels of any real size have actually been fielded in large numbers by the Navy so far. A new test port is a real, verifiable step. On its own, it isn't evidence that the broader vision works. What does this tell us about the moment we're in? Probably this: the Navy is genuinely trying to diversify who builds its ships, and companies with no traditional shipbuilding pedigree are being taken seriously as potential suppliers in a way that would have been unusual a decade ago. That's a real shift in how the Navy thinks about its supply chain, driven by concerns about the speed and cost of traditional shipbuilding compared to potential rivals. Whether Saronic specifically ends up as one of the winners in that shift isn't something the public record can answer yet. So where does this actually stand, based on what's publicly known? Confirmed. Saronic is an autonomous vessel maker that has been expanding its testing operations, and according to industry reporting, the port of Gulfport in Mississippi is now one of its test sites where the company is running trials of its Marauder unmanned surface vessel. Confirmed as general background. The Navy has an active, multi-year interest in uncrewed surface vessels, reflected in programs like Task Force 59 and the Replicator Initiative, and multiple companies, not just Saronic, are competing to supply that demand. Not confirmed, and worth saying plainly, there's no publicly available detail in this reporting about a specific Navy contract tied to this Gulfport expansion, no confirmed timeline for how long testing there will run, and no confirmed figures on funding, staffing, or the scale of operations at the new site beyond what's been generally reported about the company's growth. Put yourself in the position of a Navy program officer trying to evaluate a pitch like this. You're not just being asked whether a boat can drive itself across a bay. You're being asked to bet that a 2.5-year-old company can eventually outproduce shipyards that have been building Navy vessels for generations. That's the actual question sitting underneath a story that, on the surface, is just about a new test site in Mississippi. So we'll leave you with the open version of the question this story raises. Is the Navy's bet on companies like Saronic a genuinely faster path to a larger, more capable fleet? Or is it a bet on production promises that haven't been tested at real scale yet? We're curious what you think, especially if you follow shipbuilding or defense procurement closely. Does the pace of announcements like this match the pace of actual fielded capability, in your view? There's a detail in the underlying reporting we didn't have room to unpack fully here, specifically around how Saronic's production ambitions compare, hull for hull, to established Gulf Coast shipbuilders like Austal and Ingalls. If that's a comparison you'd want us to break down in a follow-up, let us know in the comments and we'll consider it for a future video. For now, here's what we can say with confidence. A company that didn't exist 4 years ago is now running unmanned vessel trials in Mississippi waters, in a region already built around naval shipbuilding, at a moment when the Navy is actively looking for exactly the kind of capability it's offering. That much is real, and it's documented. What happens next, whether this becomes a footnote in Saronic's growth story or a real step toward a Navy contract, isn't written yet, and we'll be watching the primary sources closely to see which way it goes. If you want to track this story yourself, the best places to look are Saronic's own public statements, defense industry outlets like USNI News and Naval News, and any official announcements from the Mississippi State Port Authority, which oversees operations at the Port of Gulfport. Those primary sources will carry any confirmed contract news well before it reaches general coverage.